I was watching the Sean Ryan RFK interview recently, and I realized that interview was inundated with misinformation and lies about the war in Ukraine. And I really hate the term misinformation. It's very far lefty. It reeks of like censor that, ban that. So I'll just say lies. The interview was full of lies. Now I want to clarify something. This video is not meant to antagonize or alienate Trump supporters, RFK supporters, anti-establishment people, libertarians, or anything of the sort, or anti-war people. This video is simply meant to clarify the reality of what has happened and is happening in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. The initial piece of misinformation in this interview is the implication that BlackRock or Lockheed Martin are active meddlers or instigators in the conflict in Ukraine.
Military contractors, Northrop Grumman and Boeing and Lockheed and General Dynamics and, these others, they're all owned by one company, which is BlackRock. And BlackRock has the contracts to destroy Ukraine, and it has the contract to rebuild Ukraine. So, and it's one of the biggest owners of the Republican and Democratic Party.
The implication that the military-industrial complex acts at the behest of BlackRock is ridiculous. BlackRock only owns 6% of Lockheed Martin. There are many other private and public shareholders of Lockheed. The insinuation that somehow or another the furtherance of this war is as a result of scary, rich, white men whose faces you don't know working in corporate buildings is sexy, appealing, but there's no basis in reality for this narrative at all. This implies that anyone who aids Ukraine in its right to resist an illegal invasion is participating in the destruction of Ukraine. You could apply this to World War II. Are you supporting Czechoslovakia, Poland? You're aiding in their destruction. The idea that sending someone weapons in their attempt to defend their sovereign state from being illegally conquered and annexed is somehow morally equivalent to the illegally invading force that has kidnapped thousands of Ukrainian children, killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian people, and displaced millions. The idea that these two things are morally equal is ridiculous. The fact that RFK even refers to BlackRock's investment in Lockheed as the destruction of Ukraine is ridiculous. I'm not here to die on some hill for random rich people I don't know, but common sense is still common sense regardless of how rich the person in the scenario might be. The reality of the situation is supporting Ukraine is not aiding in the destruction of Ukraine. And in fact, the support we gave them might be the only reason why they didn't get annexed and destroyed. The next blatant lie is the claim that this war is a result of NATO expansion. We're still, for some reason, arguing about this. I don't know why, but we're going to go over why that's blatantly false again.
And the Ukraine war is really about the expansion of NATO. We wanted to put NATO and President Putin and every president before him have said that's a red line. You can't put NATO in Ukraine. The Russians have been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. Last time, Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. We've never experienced an invasion like that. Russians haven't. Everybody remembers it. And they don't want a foreign enemy army in Ukraine, and particularly they don't want an army with nuclear weapons. And, we have put nuclear-ready systems, these Aegis missile systems that Lockheed makes in Romania and Poland. So we made those NATO countries.
The problem with this narrative is that Vladimir Putin has all but abandoned the NATO narrative that he used to start this war. The reality is that when Tucker Carlson went to Russia to interview Vladimir Putin and asked him about the war in Russia and all about why NATO's aggressive and overexpansive and so antagonistic, Vladimir Putin did not want to talk about NATO anymore. The reason why is for 2 reasons in particular. Number 1, as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Sweden and Finland joined NATO. Why do you think they did that? Why do you think Finland, who borders Russia, immediately wanted to join NATO after the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Could it possibly be that maybe these nation states want to be safe from Russian aggression and expansion? The second reason for why this narrative is no longer being used by Vladimir Putin himself is because if NATO actually wanted to harm Russia, if NATO actually wanted to harm Russia in that way, now would be the time to do it. Russia hasn't been this weak economically and militarily in decades. If there was ever an opportunity to invade Russia and violate Russian sovereignty, it would be now. Russia can hardly defeat Ukraine. Imagine if just Europe alone joined in the war. Russia would automatically lose. NATO has no interest in compromising Russian national security, compromising Russian sovereignty. There's only one nation that's interested in compromising the national security and integrity of other states, and that's Russia.
Why do we want to go into NATO? Here's one of the reasons. Why do we want every country in Europe? We promised in 1992, when Gorbachev said, I'm going to remove the walls in Europe. I'm going to allow you, the West, to reunite Germany under NATO, and I'm going to move out 450,000 Soviet troops from Germany, from East Germany, and I'm going to allow you to march NATO soldiers into their barracks. Okay, he could never go back to Russia after that. He went back, but he was despised. Nobody went to his funeral. But he did it because he wanted to end the Cold War. But he said, I want one promise from you before I do this. He said this to James Baker, to President Bush at that time, and to John Major. He said, I want one promise, which is after I give you Germany, you cannot move NATO you cannot move NATO to the east until all the other countries we're going to march out of. James Baker, who was the Secretary of State, famously told Gorbachev, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east.
This lie in particular is what I have automatically just disqualified him from ever being president off this lie alone. All of this stuff is researchable or Googleable. No, it is not true that NATO ever made a promise to the Soviet Union to never expand eastward. This did not happen. I need people to understand the US alone, nor the US and Germany alone, can make any promises to never expand NATO eastward. That would require all NATO nation states to agree to this plan and then sign a formal agreement with Russia. The 2+4 agreement that presides over the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany. In that agreement, there is no such term in which NATO will not expand eastward in exchange for the dissolution of the Soviet Union or the reunification of Germany. This is false. I don't know why people continue to peddle this information as true, but it is not true. Gorbachev himself denies that this ever took place, so I don't really understand why RFK is peddling this lie still. I wonder how much of this is RFK being misinformed, or maybe how much of this is RFK actually being a malevolent actor. I don't know, but this is patently false. However, there is a document that Russia did sign as it pertains to NATO expansion. The problem is, this document doesn't talk about NATO not being able to expand. In fact, it talks about Russia having to respect NATO's right to welcome anyone who wants to join when they so please. This document is called the NATO-Russia Founding Act that was signed in 1997. So there was an agreement. Russia did sign a contract. The problem is they signed the wrong one. They signed the one in which they promised to respect NATO's integrity and ability to welcome anyone into the alliance. The fact that RFK doesn't know about this, or prefer to just not mention it to convince you of something else, is troublesome, because this is an individual who wants to be president of the United States. RFK then makes a claim that the reason as to why NATO wants more nation states to be a part of NATO is for more war and to sell more weapons of war. This is one of the most layman takes I've ever seen on NATO ever, and NATO's not really hard to understand. And furthermore, it's a very lazy analysis of how NATO works and who buys weapons from whom within NATO.
And in 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the first of the neocons, says, okay, here's a plan. He publishes a plan are moving NATO into every former Soviet territory. And people go crazy at that time. George Kennan, who is the most important diplomat in modern American history, who was the architect of the containment policy during the Cold War, he said, if you do that, you're going to turn Russia into an enemy. You should be treating it as a friend. You should be welcoming it to the global community and using it as a bulwark against Chinese expansion. Kissinger said that. George Kennan said that. George Kennan said, if you do this, you're going to force Russia into a violent response. Bill Pierce, who was then the Secretary of Defense, threatened to resign to Clinton. He said, if you do this, I'm going to resign. It's so destabilizing to move NATO to the east. Bill Perry, who was then, and Bill Pierce is now the head of the CIA. Bill Perry, who was then the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, said the same thing. He said, you're forcing Russia into ultimately a violent response if you keep moving NATO to the east. What do? We did it anyway. Why do we want to move NATO to the east? There's all kinds of geopolitical reasons that the neocons want to drive because they like conflict. But, the big reason is that when a new country signs onto NATO, it has to then change all of its weapons specifications, weapons purchases to NATO specifications, which means it has to buy all of its weapons from Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman and the U.S. military contractors that are all owned by BlackRock.
I think it's interesting that RFK names all of these politicians who apparently had such a strong issue with NATO expanding to the east. The problem is, they were wrong. Can RFK name a single NATO state that's been invaded by Russia? He can't. The reality is, the NATO expansion has worked. And former Soviet states want to be a part of NATO because they don't want anything to do with Russia anymore. They want to be safe from Russia. Coincidentally enough, Russia seems to respect the combined might of NATO. The reason as to why NATO expansion is supported today is because of the invasion of Ukraine. The reality is the Baltic states would be much easier for Vladimir Putin to take over, but he can't do it because those states would invoke Article 5. Furthermore, Sweden and Finland joined NATO recently as a result of Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. Why hasn't Vladimir Putin sent a few divisions over there to bully them? He won't. He could. He could do it, but he won't. Because he'll lose. Vladimir Putin only respects strength. That's why they haven't invaded a NATO state. Ukraine is one of the last few vestiges of expansion, opportunities for expansion that Russia can take advantage of. That is why they're doing this. The reality is, yes, NATO expansion is the reason why this war is happening, but not because of why RFK says it is. If Ukraine was a part of NATO, Russia wouldn't be invading right now. It's just the facts. They wouldn't be invading. They won't invade any other NATO nation state that they claim has a historical connection to Russia. When Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin, Vladimir didn't want to talk about NATO anymore. He instead wanted to talk about the Russian connection and thousands of years ago. That doesn't just apply only to Ukraine. So it's mighty convenient that now all of a sudden he wants to list all of these irrelevant American statesmen who were wrong about their predictions about Russian aggression, and somehow or another, that's supposed to invalidate the policies we engage in today. RFK also insinuates that somehow or another NATO is this big weapons arm dealing company as sort of situation. The problem with that is that NATO nation states buy weapons from one another. As of right now, the United States Marine Corps utilizes Heckler & Koch rifles. Poland has purchased multiple tanks from South Korea, and the United Kingdom sells weapons to France, Germany, Italy, India. This is not some situation where every single NATO state has to buy American weapons. However, if you want to be a part of NATO, It would make sense that if you want to be a part of a defensive military alliance, that everyone's using ammunition and weaponry that's cross-compatible. Why would we all use weapons that aren't cross-compatible or ammo that's not cross-compatible? Like, why would we choose to be incompetent on the battlefield? Furthermore, it begs the question, why wouldn't these nation states want to buy state-of-the-art weaponry from American companies? Where else are they going to buy them from? Russia? They're bums. Like, I hate to say, I don't, like, realistically, the United States has better weaponry than Russia. Realistically, it makes more sense to utilize cross-compatible ammunition, and realistically, it makes sense to want to buy rockets and other forms of weaponry from the state-of-the-art defense contractors in the world. Just because the United States stands to gain financially from a new state joining NATO does not automatically mean that that's the purpose of NATO. Furthermore, there's another hole in RFK's argument. If the United States was so money hungry as it pertains to NATO, why is it that we sat there and allowed NATO to slack off on their defense spending? They spent years spending less than 2% of their GDP on defense. Years. Years they've been doing this. Many NATO nation states have been slacking on their defense spending from their GDP. The only person to really kick up a storm was Donald Trump, and I gotta give credit to Uncle Trump. He was right. They were slacking, and we see it today with the war in Ukraine. If NATO was all about this weapons selling and America making all this money and having a monopoly on defense contracting, why didn't we pressure them to spend more? Why? Why didn't we pressure them to meet the minimum that we had set? That all of us NATO states had set? Why didn't we? I'm curious, like, there's no answer. There is no answer for this. The reality is, no, it's not some BlackRock conspiracy. Like, it wouldn't make sense. Why would BlackRock allow these nation states to not spend the minimum amount? If BlackRock can do all of these things, cause a war in Ukraine, all of this, why would they allow these nation states to not spend the proper amount of their GDP on defense, aka buying American weapons? Why would BlackRock allow these companies, these countries to buy non-American weapons? Like, it doesn't add up. Or why would NATO or why would America allow any of these things? Big scary company, therefore war. It's just not that simple. It's never that simple. I wish it was, but it's not.
So there's this economic imperative to drive NATO into all of these new countries. And, you know, Putin said again and again, if you go in there, we are going to have to fight back. What do? In 2014, the CIA goes in with USAID and overthrows the elected government of Ukraine. And we put in a Western government. The Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who's the top neocon at that time, we now have a tape of her talking to the U.S. ambassador a month before the coup, handpicking the cabinet that would replace the neutral government with a pro-Western government. So then we go in there, we overthrow their elected government, we put in a government that's sympathetic to us. Putin immediately says, oh, well, now they're going to put the U.S. fleet in Vladivostok, which was Russia's, for 340 years, their only southern port. That's where the Soviet fleet is, which is in Crimea. And he says, and so he said, if you do this, we're going to go into Crimea. He goes in Crimea. He doesn't fire a shot because the people of Crimea have always wanted to be back with Russia. They voted 90-10 to go back to Russia. And then
there is a leaked audio of Nuland speaking about potential members of the new Ukrainian government that they would like to see in charge. Notice the language RFK uses. He says that the CIA worked to replace the neutral Ukrainian government with a pro-Western government. The problem is, Yanukovych was never neutral. At this stage in the video, I do believe RFK is purposefully lying. You can't get this much stuff, like, surgically wrong. Yanukovych was definitely not neutral. when he was ousted from leadership, where did he conveniently end up in? Russia. Furthermore, we need to talk about why he was ousted. The reason as to why he was ousted was because he decided not to sign a political and free trade agreement with the EU and instead chose to tighten Ukraine's relations to Russia. The problem is, the Ukrainians did not want to be closer to Russia. And how we know that is because right now, they're fighting a war tooth and nail to not be a part of Russia. And they fought tooth and nail before the West was even fully backing them in 2022. When they were first invaded in 2022, they fought back. Then we began to back them in totality. The reality is, both Russia and the West were playing games of chess in Ukraine, and Russia lost. But he specifically claims the government was neutral so that you think Ukraine was just chilling and minding their business, and then the big, bad, manipulative, and meddling West came in and fucked it all up. That's not true. It's not true, and all of this is verifiably not true. Why RFK chooses to mislead his audience in this way, I don't know, but this is not responsible from someone who wants to be president. I don't know, what did, overthrew the neutral, this requires two things. One, you would have to completely, notice he does not mention the fact that the Ukrainian people did not want Yanukovych at all. It wasn't some rogue faction that staged a coup. It was an actual grassroots movement of the people who wanted him gone. It wasn't some fringe minority organization that busted into the Capitol building and held everybody at gunpoint. No, the actual Ukrainian people wanted him gone. JFK. RFK specifically avoids mentioning this, and he specifically says it was a neutral government to make you think that the Ukrainian people were not acting in their own agency. The Ukrainian people don't want this. The manipulative West came in and tricked them into turning on a perfectly neutral government that was acting in their interests. All of this is verifiably false. Why he continues down this path, I don't know. The phone call doesn't prove anything. It's standard geopolitics for nations to have preferred leaders of other nations. Of course, the US has an idea of who they would prefer to be in charge of Ukraine. That's not evidence that the CIA created a revolution overnight that had nothing to do with the actual desires of the Ukrainian people. This entire thing is just looking for little coincidences and trying to string together this big conspiracy theory with literally zero evidence. Even this phone call alone is not evidence of the United States fomenting a revolution. Zero. And for some reason, RFK thinks it's appropriate and understandable and tolerable that Putin then decides to invade Ukraine and take Crimea because the Ukrainians, the uppity Ukrainians, had the audacity to decide who they wanted to be in control of their country and who they wanted their country to be associated with. They didn't even try to join NATO yet, and NATO wouldn't even allow them to join at this particular time. And yet Putin still saw fit to invade Ukraine. The fact that RFK cannot condemn this illegal act, cannot understand that Vladimir Putin's reasons for invading Ukraine are almost always, if literally completely illegal. The fact that he can't acknowledge this is not presidential. This is insane. RFK then claims that Ukraine banned the Russian language. That is not true. You can still speak Russian in Ukraine. All of Ukraine's Ukrainianization laws and prioritization of the Ukrainian language laws are dated back to 2017. This is an important date because RFK tries to make it seem like after the revolution, immediately after, Ukraine just took this almost Jim Crow-esque response to the existence of Russian people in Ukraine. But in reality, they didn't really start passing laws on this until 2017, years after Russia illegally annexed Crimea and supported, armed, funded, trained, and participated in rebellion and secession attempts with the Donbass region. This was not an act of racial or ethnic hatred done by Ukraine, but an attempt to Ukrainianize and nationalize their nation in the face of an invading force trying to invalidate their existence and take their country from them. No, the Russian language is not banned in Ukraine. The importing of Russian books was limited. The prioritization of the Ukrainian language in newspapers was done. The prioritization of Ukrainian in broadcasts was done. The prioritization of Ukrainian in public spaces was done, but you are still allowed to speak Russian in Ukraine. RFK then accuses the Ukrainian government that was installed by the West of killing 14,000 people in the Donbass region, which is why the Donbass rebelled. The problem is, the Donbass rebelled first, and then 14,000 people died. But it wasn't 14,000 Russian speakers who were rounded up and killed. Instead, in the Donbass war, and I have the figures here, 14,000 were killed. 6,500 were Russian soldiers and Russian proxies. 4,400 were Ukrainian forces, and 3,400 were civilians on both sides. In this clip, RFK basically accuses the Ukrainian government of ethnic discrimination and genocide, neither of which took place. I don't know why he would do this. I don't know why he thinks this is true, but all of this is easily verifiably false.
Then he says, and then there's a revolution. There's, in this new government comes in and basically illegalizes the Russian language. There used to be two languages in Ukraine, Russian and Ukrainian. Now they say, no, the official language is now Ukrainian. You can't speak Russian. We don't teach it in the schools, etc. And they begin enacting these other oppressive mandates against the Russian, ethnic Russians in Donbass. And so there are protests in Donbass. Those protests turn violent. And, the question is, why do they turn violent? The assumption is there's right-wingers in the new government that we put in who kill 14,000 people from Donbass and Lugansk. And so Putin says, look, I'm going to go in there. Donbass and Lugansk vote to join Russia, the Russian Federation. Putin says, I don't want you. You stay with Ukraine, but here's a proposal. And he gives what is called the Minsk Accords, which Germany approves of, France approves of, and UK approve of. And the Minsk Accords say, we're going to keep NATO out of Ukraine. We're going to give Donbass and Lugansk autonomy, just like Montreal, Quebec, part of Canada. You'll still be part of Ukraine, but you'll be able to keep the Russian language. And then he also asked to denazify some of denazify the new government that we had put in, to remove some of the extreme right-wingers. And all of these nations approve of this agreement. And Zelensky runs in 2019, and he's an actor and a comedian, no political involvement at all. He runs on one issue. I'm going to sign the Minsk Accords, and there's going to be peace with Russia. He wins 70% of the vote. So, overwhelmingly, the people wanted peace. They wanted that agreement. Suddenly, he gets in office and he pivots, and he says, I'm not going to sign it. Why did that happen? There's two assumptions. We don't know, but there's two assumptions. One, he was threatened by right-wingers within his own government. Two, the United States, Victoria Nuland, told him he couldn't sign it. So Putin then sends in 40,000 troops. The West says, oh, he's trying to conquer Europe. He's like Hitler marching on Europe. He sends 40,000 troops. He clearly does not even want to conquer Ukraine. Ukraine had 44 million people in it. He can't conquer with 40,000 troops.
Yeah.
What Putin says, I just want you back at the negotiating table. Zelensky then says, well, ask the United States to help him negotiate. We won't help him. He asked President Xi of China to help him. Xi won't help him. He goes to Naftali Bennett, the prime minister of Israel, and Israel says, yeah, we'll help you. And to Erdogan in Turkey. So Erdogan Naftali Bennett referee discussions between Zelensky and Putin, and they come to an agreement, which is like Minsk Accords too. It's the same agreement, and they sign the agreement. And the main thing Putin wants is we agree never to put NATO into Ukraine, and they agree to that. We sign that agreement, and Joe Biden sends Boris Johnson over from the UK, who's now the former prime minister, to tell Zelensky he's got to tear up the agreement because we wanted the war. And Zelensky tears it up. And, since then, there's probably been 600,000 Ukrainian kids who have died over there, totally unnecessarily.
Number one, the assertion that the Minsk Agreement had anything to do with NATO is false. You could look through both of them, and there is no mention of NATO in either of the terms of either of the Minsk Accords. Number one. Number two, Minsk 1 was broken when Russia attacked Debaltseve. Russia broke Minsk 1. Then he talks about the denazification of Ukraine. Need I remind RFK, you do know Vladimir Putin hired a neo-Nazi to do his dirty work. Dmitry Utkin, the leader of Wagner Group, the root of the military infrastructure of Wagner Group, had Waffen-SS tattoos on his collarbone. This individual was a neo-Nazi. The Russians knew he was and still hired him anyway. Worse yet, the name Wagner is not even Russian. It's a German word. Why did the group have a German name? It had a German name because Dmitry Utkin, the neo-Nazi, named the organization after one of Hitler's favorite musical composers. The dude's he was a fanboy. He's dead now. Putin, I think, blew him up. The dude was a fanboy of Hitler. But somehow, Vladimir Putin's he's the expert on neo-Nazism, and he gets to invade entire countries of people to expunge neo-Nazism, but it's okay if he literally hires neo-Nazis to do his dirty work. This is America in 2024. This is one of our presidential candidates. Then he tries to blame Zelensky for the downfall of Minsk, while completely ignoring the fact that Russia broke Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, and to make matters worse, Russia broke the Budapest Memorandum, an agreement in which they promised to uphold and protect Ukraine's sovereignty after Ukraine turned over nuclear weapons to Russia. There were many other people a part of that deal, many other nation states. Which nation state do you think broke that agreement? The only sole one, the lone one. You guessed it, Russia. After breaking all of these peace deals, RFK is mind blown that Zelensky decided not to keep going into all these different Minsk Accords with Russia. He's mind blown. Then he claims that somehow or another, Zelensky was swayed away from signing a peace deal by Boris Johnson. There is no evidence of this at all. Boris Johnson vehemently denies this. And furthermore, let's just say it was true. Why is that a problem again? Russia illegally invades Ukraine in 2014 because Ukraine ousted a Russian figurehead. They annexed Crimea, and then they ferment rebellion and secession in the Donbass. That kills 14,000 people in total. Then they illegally invade again and try to annex the entire nation state of Ukraine. They break 3 different agreements. And somehow you think Vladimir Putin can have peace made with him. RFK is naive. He's unbelievably naive. Either he's naive or he's a Russian asset. There's literally nothing between the two that I can't. There's no choice between. Either he just isn't paying attention and is trusting some millennial Gen Z anti-establishment person in his camp to tell him what's going on, or he's a literal Russian asset. Unfortunately, this is what we're dealing with. This is unfortunately what we're dealing with. RFK lies continuously throughout this video, and it's absolutely unfortunate. It's highly unfortunate, and he accuses the Ukrainian government of genocide in this video, which, after Russia kidnapped thousands of Ukrainian kids, the fact that he doesn't mention that is mind-blowing to me, truly. And then he ultimately blames the deaths of 600,000 people on Zelensky in the West. He doesn't even think that, damn, Putin, like, you really have a hard time keeping agreements, huh? You really have a hard time not invading sovereign countries, huh? I don't mean to be Ja Rule here, but, or juvenile, excuse me. I don't mean to be juvenile, but like, how is it that Putin can break all of these agreements, do all of these illegal invasions, and you somehow manage to lay the blame at Zelensky, Joe Biden, and Boris Johnson? Okay, the joking, we've joked enough. What I want people to take away from this is this. This isn't meant to humiliate, make fun of, or attack RFK or his supporters or anyone who's anti-establishment or whatever the case that it might be. The point of this video is to understand that just because someone is anti-establishment does not mean you should believe anything they tell you. Always do your due diligence. Always research. Yes, you can use Wikipedia. I know people laugh at that, but the reality is you're not going to get a cohesive chronological order of events from any other website that's verifiable. Okay? Do your own research. Okay? Almost everything, if not everything he said, is demonstrably false in this video. And the unfortunate reality is that we have a massive wave of misinformation coming from the right wing, coming from anti-establishment populists, and that's not responsible. There's nothing wrong with having a difference in opinion from the establishment, but don't lie to your audience to push a narrative that is not true, because then if they vote for you and your policies create a disaster based on misinformation and lies, you're going to fracture this country. You're going to hurt the relationship between Americans. It is not cool for people like Tucker, Tulsi, RFK to be lying like this. This is not, it is funny, but it's not cool. It is not okay. Please stop. I'm not advocating for RFK to be banned, censored, deplatformed, but there needs to be some sort of misinformation thing under that Sean Ryan episode. But there needs to be a misinformation tag underneath that video, so people understand that they're watching fan fiction. Don't know how else to put it, but it is what it is. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you for watching.